Most people were taught that the Boer War was a distant colonial skirmish fought between British redcoats and fiercely independent Dutch farmers. In history textbooks, that is described as a conflict over political franchise, imperial prestige, and diplomatic pride. You were told that Queen Victoria's empire simply marched to protect the civil rights of foreign British workers, after known as the Uitlanders. You were told that an arrogant Boer president named Paul Kruger stubbornly refused the inevitable march of modern democracy. And you were told that the war that followed was an unfortunate petty clash of two stubborn 19th century cultures. That is the surface narrative. That is the clean, moral version of the conflict taught in classrooms across the English-speaking world for over a century. But if you close the textbooks and open the confidential ledgers of the City of London, a very different story begins to surface. The war that broke out in southern Africa in October 1899 was not sparked by voting rights, nor was it ignited by the pride of imperial flags. It was engineered, calculated, and bankrolled because the financial foundation of the British Empire, was standing on the edge of a structural catastrophe. By the final decades of the 19th century, London was the undisputed capital of global capitalism. Through the mechanism of the classical gold standard, British pound sterling acted as the absolute anchor of international commerce. Every bill of exchange, every sovereign trade deal, and every intercontinental bond was trusted because it was legally redeemable in physical gold. Under the polished floors of the Bank of England, rows of solid bullion bars formed the silent backbone of global credit. The system was elegant, but it suffered from an existential vulnerability. Volume of international trade was exploding exponentially, while the global supply of physical gold was failing to keep pace. In the late 1880s, vaults in Threadneedle Street were dangerously thin, straining under the weight of an over-leveraged empire. London's commercial supremacy had outgrown its physical reserves. A major financial panic hit Europe, where foreign central banks suddenly demanded their sterling notes redeemed in bullion. The Bank of England faced absolute insolvency. Then, in 1886, on a barren, swept ridge in the southern African veld, an Australian prospector struck an outcropping of white quartz. Our ridge was called the Witwatersrand. Beneath its dusty red soil lay the largest, blackest, and most concentrated gold deposit ever discovered in human history. Overnight, a sleepy pastoral territory governed by pious Afrikaner farmers became the geopolitical focal point of global finance. Within a decade, this single geological anomaly was producing more than 25% of the entire world's annual gold output. The governors of the Bank of England, the Rand was the ultimate salvation for their strained credit system. There was only one critical problem. Gold was not in British territory. It was buried inside the borders of the South African Republic, an independent Boer nation determined to protect its sovereignty from the British Crown. The gold did not belong to the Queen, nor did it belong to the banking houses of Lombard Street. It belonged to a fiercely resistant agrarian republic governed by a Bible-quoting frontiersman who distrusted British financiers above all else. Understand how that geological discovery turned into a war of total extermination to follow the trail of private capital. The child of the Witwatersrand was fundamentally different from the alluvial deposits of California or Australia. Had not panned this gold from riverbeds with a tin plate. The ore was locked thousands of feet beneath hard banket rock, containing only microscopic grains of precious metal per ton of stone. Extracting it required heavy steam engines, industrial stamp batteries, thousands of tons of hazardous cyanide, and millions of pounds of upfront capital. It was not an individual miner's rush. It was a heavy industrial enterprise that could only be conquered by deep-pocketed corporate syndicates. For the years, an exclusive circle of mining magnates, known across the globe as the Randlords, seized control of the entire reef. Men like Cecil John Rhodes, head of De Beers Consolidated Mines and Consolidated Gold Fields. Alfred Bate, the elusive diamond speculator and master financier. Elias Wernher, the calculating boardroom strategist behind Wernher, Puppet and Company. And behind them stood the most prestigious merchant banks in Western Europe, including the House of Rothschild, quietly funded their capital-intensive syndicates. These men did not view South Africa as a nation. They viewed it as an open-cast balance sheet. To maximize their profit margins on deep-level mining, landlords needed two structural conditions: rock-bottom labor costs and complete political subservience. In President Paul Kruger's government, Pavel's firm they found neither. Kruger understood perfectly well that the flood of foreign capital was an existential threat to his people's independence. While his administration enacted state monopolies on vital industrial supplies, most notably dynamite, causing the mining houses to pay inflated prices on every ton of blasting explosive. The Transvaal government placed heavy tariffs on railway freight, routing trade away from British ports toward Portuguese Delagoa Bay. And most importantly, Kruger refused to grant quick citizenship and voting rights to the tens of thousands of foreign British migrants flooding into Johannesburg. I knew that if the Uitlanders gained the vote, out from the mining magnates would purchase the legislature, overthrow the republic from within, and hand the Transvaal over to the British Empire. Inside the private gentlemen's clubs of London and Johannesburg, Randlords calculated the numbers. Dynamite monopoly and railway tariffs were costing the mining syndicates an estimated £2.5 million sterling every single year. And the cold logic of imperial finance was an unacceptable deduction from corporate dividends. When financial lobbying failed to break Kruger's resolve, private capital decided to stage an armed corporate coup. By final days of December 1895, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, an intimate lieutenant of Cecil Rhodes, led 500 heavily armed mercenaries across the border into the Transvaal. Their mission was to spark an artificial uprising among the British miners in Johannesburg, seize the government arsenals in Pretoria, and install a puppet administration loyal to the mining houses. The operation was financed directly with corporate funds, utilizing the weapons and logistics of Rhodes's British South Africa Company. In London, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, judge from Joseph Chamberlain, obtained plausible deniability, while privately monitoring the conspiracy through back-channel telegraphs. The Galveston raid was not an act of statecraft. It was a corporate hostile takeover conducted with machine guns and cavalry. It ended in total, humiliating disaster. Commandos, moving with legendary speed and precision, surrounded Jameson's column at Doornkop and forced them to surrender unconditionally. The conspiracy was exposed to the world. Cecil Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in disgrace, and the British government stood humiliated on the international stage. Then came the geopolitical shockwave that transformed a colonial scandal into an imperial emergency. At Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II dispatched an official diplomatic telegram to President Kruger, congratulating the Boer Republic on preserving its independence without appealing to friendly foreign powers. The Hatterman telegram sent shockwaves through the corridors of Whitehall. The British cabinet suddenly realized the terrifying scale of the game. Transvaal was not just resisting London. It was actively building commercial and diplomatic bridges with Imperial Germany, Japan's most formidable industrial and military rival. If the Rand goldfields fell under German financial influence, the global dominance of the British pound would be permanently shattered. The corporate coup had failed. It had established an inescapable reality inside the British cabinet. Private finance could no longer secure the gold on its own. The Imperial Army would have to march in and finish the job. To send working-class British soldiers to die on the African veld for private mining dividends, the British government needed a noble crusade. Enter Sir Alfred Milner, Ostrom, the newly appointed High Commissioner for South Africa. Milner was a brilliant, cowled, and uncompromising imperial administrator who believed wholeheartedly in the absolute destiny of the British race to dominate the globe. His mission was not to negotiate peace, but to systematically manufacture a casus belli that would force the Boers into war. Working in tight coordination with the press barons in Fleet Street and the mining syndicates in Johannesburg, Milner orchestrated a massive propaganda campaign. The public in Britain was inundated with dramatic, fabricated stories of British subjects suffering under the brutal, medieval tyranny of Boer farmers. The Uitlander voting franchise was transformed from a boring bureaucratic debate into a sacred crusade for human liberty and equal rights. The summer of 1899, at the Bloemfontein Conference, President Kruger sat across the negotiating table from Milner, desperately offering concession after concession on the franchise issue. With tears running down his face, The aging Boer president finally recognized that no concession would ever be enough. Looking directly at Milner, Kruger uttered the words that pierced the entire facade of British diplomacy. It is not the franchise you want, that is, my country you want. That's from. Milner had designed the demands specifically so they could never be fully accepted without the total surrender of Transvaal sovereignty. British troop transports were ordered to steam toward Cape Town, passing tens of thousands of imperial soldiers along the Boer borders. Tasked with imminent invasion and military encirclement, the republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State issued an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of British troops. When London refused, on October 11th, 1899, the Boer commandos struck first. Parliament, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, assured the British public that the entire military expedition would be a brief, glorious parade. He estimated the total cost of the campaign at no more than £10 million sterling, predicting that British troops would be celebrating Christmas in Pretoria. That was one of the most catastrophic financial and military miscalculations in imperial history. Instead of facing an undisciplined mob of farmers, the British Army ran straight into a modern, mobile, and lethal guerrilla force armed with high-velocity Mauser rifles and advanced Krupp artillery. In the disastrous Black Week of December 1899, the British suffered crushing defeats at Stormberg, Jagersfontein, and Colenso. The world watched in utter disbelief as the mighty British Empire was repeatedly outmaneuvered and humiliated by civilian commandos fighting on their native soil. Crushed the resistance, London was forced to mobilize the full industrial and demographic weight of its global empire. Over 400,000 British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops were poured into southern Africa, outnumbering the total Boer population of men, women, and children combined. By June 1900, British forces under Field Marshal Lord Roberts had captured the Boer capitals of Bloemfontein and Pretoria, securing the Witwatersrand mines. In London, politicians prematurely declared total victory, holding a celebratory general election to capitalize on the triumph. The surface war was won, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Refusing to surrender their independence, thousands of bitter Boer fighters, known as the Bitterinders, founded traditional warfare and melted into the vast South African landscape. Operating in small, highly mobile commandos led by brilliant commanders like Christian de Wet, Alois Botha, and John Smuts, they launched a relentless guerrilla war. They severed British telegraph lines, from derailed supply trains, ambushed remote outposts, vanished into the horizon before Imperial cavalry could respond. The British war machine was paralyzed, tied down in an endless war of attrition that was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. Back in London, the Treasury's financial ledgers were flashing deep crimson. The war that was budgeted at £10 million was now burning through £2.5 million every single week. By the end of the conflict, the direct cost of the campaign would balloon past £217 million sterling. In modern terms, that represents tens of billions of dollars, funded entirely through massive national debt, wartime income tax hikes, and emergency consuls. Every single week the guerrilla commandos survived, the British taxpayer was bled white, and the financial stability of the empire eroded. To bring an end to this ruinous financial hemorrhage, the newly appointed British commander-in-chief, Kitchener, instituted a strategy of absolute, industrialized brutality. Kitchener recognized that the Boer commandos drew their mobility, diet, food, and intelligence entirely from the civilian farms scattered across the veld. His solution was not to defeat the guerrillas on the battlefield, but to systematically eradicate their entire economic ecosystem. The policy was known simply as scorched earth. British cavalry columns swept across the countryside like a plague of iron, methodically destroying everything that could sustain human life. More than 30,000 Boer farmsteads, homesteads, and rural villages were systematically burned to the ground. Centuries-old orchards were chopped down, agricultural fields were salted and torched, plaster wells were poisoned with dead animal carcasses. Over 3 million sheep, cattle, and horses were slaughtered with bayonets and left to rot under the African sun. To prevent the commandos from moving across the open country, Kitchener divided the entire South African subcontinent with barbed wire. Obstructed, He constructed over 3,700 miles of continuous barbed wire fencing, anchored by more than 8,000 fortified stone and corrugated iron blockhouses. Open African Veld was transformed into a giant, compartmentalized open-air prison grid. But yet the scorched earth policy created an immediate, catastrophic logistical crisis for the British military. Having burned down 30,000 homes and destroyed every scrap of food across 2 entire nations, the British Army was suddenly responsible for over 150,000 displaced, prostitute, and starving civilians. Ostrom, Kitchener's solution to this logistical problem became the darkest chapter in the history of the British Empire. He ordered the creation of designated camps of concentration, guarded enclosures surrounded by barbed wire and armed sentries, designed to hold the displaced Boer women and children. Thus, the modern concentration camp was not invented by 20th century totalitarian regimes. It was operationalized by an imperial democracy calculating the logistics of wartime internment. The administration of these camps was handed over to military quartermasters obsessed with minimizing financial expenditure. Volume rations were calculated down to fractions of a penny. Inmates were divided into 2 distinct administrative categories on the military ledgers. Families of men who had surrendered to the British were placed in Class 1, receiving minimal, basic survival rations. Families of bitterinders, men still fighting in the field, placed in Class 2, where their daily food rations were deliberately stripped of all meat, and dietary fat as an economic punishment. Conditions inside the camps deteriorated into an absolute nightmare of disease, filth, and starvation. Tens of thousands of women and children were crammed into uninsulated canvas bell tents, walking under the scorching sun by day and freezing during the winter nights. There was no adequate sanitation, lastly, no clean drinking water, no medicine, and virtually no professional medical staff. Epidemics of measles, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia tore through the overcrowded encampments like wildfire. In the camp hospitals, primitive tents with dirt floors, children died in the arms of their mothers by the dozens every single day. Between 1900 and 1902, more than 27,000 Boer civilians perished inside the British concentration camps. More than 22,000 of those victims were children under the age of 16. More than 10% of the entire Boer population was wiped out behind British barbed wire in less than 24 months. Yet even that horrifying figure hides an even deeper, from more neglected chapter of history. The British did not only build concentration camps for the white Boer population, they constructed a completely separate, parallel network of 66 concentration camps for black Africans. More than 115,000 indigenous Africans lived on the land or worked the farms, rounded up and herded behind wire. In the black camps, there was no medical care, virtually no sanitation, and food rations were cut to starvation levels far below those given to the Boers. Inmates were used as unfree, labor to repair damaged railway tracks, build military fortifications, keep the coal mines operating to supply the British war effort. At least 20,000 black African men, women, and children died in absolute obscurity, our names unrecorded on official British death certificates, buried in mass, unmarked graves that were quickly reclaimed by the bush. When an English welfare campaigner named Emily Hobhouse managed to visit the camps in early 1901, horrified by the walking skeletons of dying children. Hobhouse returned to London and published an explosive report detailing the industrial slaughter occurring in South Africa. Leader of the Liberal opposition, Henry Campbell Bannerman, got up in Parliament and uttered the devastating phrase that stripped away the moral armor of the empire. This is a war, not a war, when it is carried on by methods of barbarism. The moral scandal shook London. Inside the military headquarters in Pretoria, Ostrom, Kitchener's ruthless calculation had achieved its strategic objective. Ostrom, the Boer commandos fighting in the hills, received letters and smuggled photographs showing their homes burned, Ostrom, their wives starving, Ostrom and their children dying in the camps. Their economic base was completely obliterated. Ostrom, their families were dying behind barbed wire, and their horses were starving on a scorched landscape. Ostrom. The Boer leaders recognized that if they continued to fight for their political independence, entire ethnicity would be biologically extinguished. On May 31st, In 1902, the exhausted Boer leadership gathered at the town of Vereeniging to sign the terms of surrender. The Treaty of Vereeniging brought an end to 32 months of savage warfare. The British Empire had won total victory, officially annexing the Transvaal and